Hi, everybody, and thank you for coming out of the lovely weather and to the big history class. I'm really glad. Before we start, I want to tell you three things that are going on with ChronoZoom right now and big history. You remember that 2 weeks ago we had Oscar Naim here, and Oscar is the head software engineer for Microsoft Research, who's building the second version of ChronoZoom. Well, this week we have another guest, and this is Donald Brinkman, who is the project manager for ChronoZoom 2, who's down here and visiting us. So Donald, hold up your hand. Yeah. So if you have things you'd like to have go into ChronoZoom, catch him while you can. Not now, but at the end of class, okay? All right, the second thing that's going on is that yesterday was a big day. There's a TED conference going on. Some of you know about the TED Talks. And David Christian, who is the inventor of big history, and we all think of as the founder of this field, gave a TED Talk yesterday, which my understanding, I haven't seen them, but I understand that there are tweets all over the web about how great it was. And he was introduced by a fellow named Bill Gates. And in fact, we're now free to tell you something that we've been sitting on because it was kind of secret, and that is that Bill Gates, you know him, he's from Microsoft? Yeah, anyway. He's related to Donald anyway. A couple of years ago, he bought a set of videos from the teaching company by David Christian about big history, and Bill Gates was absolutely fascinated by, and just enchanted by the whole concept of big history, and by David Christian giving a lecture about it. So Bill Gates, in fact, this is wonderful. David Christian told me, he said he was sitting in his office in Australia one day, and the telephone in his office rang, and he said, "Hello?" Somebody said, "Professor Christian?" He said, "Yes." And the voice said, "Will you hold for a phone call from Bill Gates?" Well, David did accept it, and they've become quite close friends, and there is a major project underway now which is being driven by Bill Gates and some of his associates working with David Christian to develop big history into a vehicle for reforming K through 12 education. I mean, Bill Gates thinks, look, this is going to excite anybody who has a course in it. So right now they're developing a curriculum for, it's 9th grade, isn't it? Yeah, for high school, for 9th grade, and they're working on, so it's really a curious thing. Big history has two completely independent contacts with Microsoft in one way or another. One is the Bill Gates, David Christian contact, and the other is our contact over ChronoZoom with Microsoft Research. And there was absolutely no connection between these, but they're now proceeding along hand in hand. So all of that's going on. If you poke around on the web and look up right now, Bill Gates, big history, David Christian, you'll find all of this stuff. It's just been made public, so we can talk about it now. BigHistoryProject.com. Okay, check it out and let us know what you think. Okay, so the last 3 times I've given you little briefings about what's going on in Libya because of Millie's and my having lived there and this being such a major historical event that's going on right now. So I thought this time I would ask David Shimabukuro, who's a grad student with me just finishing his PhD, who can put it in the Libyan thing in a broader context on the basis of his own very recent personal experiences. So, David, come and tell us what happened to you, what you did with your winter break.
Okay. So, it was kind of fun watching the protests that are going through the Middle East and North Africa, because over winter break, I was actually out in Egypt doing this standard tourist thing. And just about 10 days after I returned, what you see up here started happening. And so it was really interesting seeing all this on the news, having just observed the country about 2 weeks before. So I just want to tell you just a few kind of points about what I saw there and kind of how it relates to big history. Okay. So when I was out there, I did the standard tourist fare, which involves going to all the pyramids and seeing all these pharaonic monuments. And it was pretty neat being there, because being a big historian, all of us being big historians, one of the first things we do is apply this concept of historical mindedness to whatever we look at. We look at this and we don't just see it as something in the present, but we ask for the history of it and how does it affect us today. And so I have to say, with Egypt, I was a bit disappointed. And I'm sorry, Dave, but when I saw these monuments here, I was just reminded of this line from the poem Ozymandias, that poem by Shelley. Ozymandias is a Greek name for the Greek or the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II, whose statue is right over there. And this line was, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains around the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare." And when I saw these monuments here, the first thing I thought was, how is this relevant to me? And I would actually argue that pharaonic Egypt is a bit distant. It left very little to the modern world. But later Egypt ended up contributing a lot to the modern world and a lot to what we see going on in the Middle East today. And so I wanted to explore those few things. So I think the history of Egypt as it applies to the modern world really starts in the 4th century BC, when a young Greek named Alexander came out of Macedonia and headed east and conquered this entire region, all the way out past Afghanistan into Central Asia, all the way out to the Indus River over here. So Alexander died young. So in 323, when he died here over here in Babylon, what happened is his empire started fragmenting, and his generals, in an effort to kind of grab land, went off into different directions, and his empire soon broke up, with the Seleucid Empire forming here, and one of his generals named Ptolemy went out here into Egypt and founded the Ptolemy dynasty. And so the Ptolemies were the last line of pharaohs, except these were interesting people because they were not Egyptian pharaohs, but they were Greek pharaohs. And this Ptolemaic dynasty actually extended from the Nile all the way out into Libya. So Cyrene is here, which gives the name to Cyrenaica, I think, Walter, which is where Benghazi is, where kind of the Libyan rebels have taken hold. So this Ptolemaic dynasty, this Greek-speaking dynasty, soon went into this great period of building. And so Ptolemy founded his capital city here in Alexandria. And so Alexandria is a city on the coast. It's most famous for in ancient times, for its lighthouse out here. It's also famous for being a center of knowledge. The Ptolemies really believed that knowledge was the way to conquer other people, to gain an upper hand on your enemies. And so what they did was in addition to founding science, they founded a library, which was located in this region right here. And so this Library of Alexandria was this amazing, amazing place, because what the Ptolemies would demand is that any ship that came into the Alexandria harbor, it would have to give up its scrolls, and the scrolls would get recopied and placed into this library. And so it was a warehouse of knowledge from anybody that did trade with Egypt. Not only that, but during this time, being Greek-speaking, it was part of the Greek Empire, and many scholars came here to study, or were actually from here. For example, Euclid, who invented geometry. We have Aristarchus, who was the first person to realize, let's see. So Aristarchus was the first person to propose that, hey, maybe the Earth is not the center of the universe, but maybe that the Earth is actually revolving around the sun. He was the first to propose a heliocentric theory. Eratosthenes was the first person to actually measure the radius of the Earth. So he knew that the Earth was a spherical object. And not only that, he was able to calculate it, the diameter of it, within a 20%. Archimedes worked out at Alexandria. This was a beautiful place that had lots of knowledge. So this area was destroyed over the next centuries, but it was really neat being out in Alexandria, because Egyptians have taken it upon themselves to recapture this heritage of knowledge, and they built this new Library of Alexandria. And so during the protest, it was kind of interesting seeing what was going on, because one of the things is that the Egyptians seem to have a very strong sense of cultural heritage. And in having this sense, what they did is, this is a picture taken by the director of this library during the protests. And this is a line of youths from Alexandria forming a line around the library, defending it from any people who would go in there and destroy the books. And so this protection of cultural heritage really happened wherever you went in Egypt during these protests. During the height of the protests, people would surround the Egyptian Museum, which is right next to Tahrir Square, and they would try to keep the looters out. So during the Greek time, we had this period of learning, right? And so this came to us just through discoveries. So the next period that really contributed a lot to the modern world was that Egypt was the center of the early Christian church. So when I was out there, we went out to one of these monasteries, a 4th century monastery, St. Clement's Monastery. Over here, you can take a look at a leaf from the earliest extant Bible from the 4th century. And so this kind of just reflects the Christian heritage of this country. And in fact, some of the early debates within the Christian church took place here. There were two characters, I guess, in the 4th century, one named Athanasius and one named Arius. So Arius was a Libyan, and he had this strange concept of who this character Christ was. And he said that Christ was not God, but he was somewhat subservient to God. And so this controversy went through the entire Eastern Empire and actually reached the halls of Constantine up in Constantinople. And Constantine basically started a council in order to settle this debate, whether this word or this word would define who Christ was. This word, homoousia, would say that Christ is of the same substance as God, that there was a Trinity. Whereas this one, with this extra I, this single vowel, meant that Christ was of a separate substance. And so this controversy tore apart the church, it tore apart the empire, and had to be settled by a council. And so in 325, these guys, Athanasius and Arius, came to this council, and the matter was actually settled. And Constantine decided right there that the Trinity did exist and Christ was God. So why is this important for greater history? It's important because this is the first time where a government organization sponsored or settled a dispute within the church. And for the next 1,500 years, this council would actually play an important role in how governments dealt with religion. Basically, the government and the church became one entity. And so when you think about history for the next 1,500 years, it's really just this debate happening over and over, and religion and government is becoming very, very related. So this is really neat because after this, Arius was kicked out of the church, and over the next several hundred years, various Christian denominations were actually kicked out of the church. One of these that was kicked out were the Copts, and so the Copts are a Christian group in Egypt. They make up about 15% of the population, and when I was there, on the night of December 31st, there was actually a bombing where 23 people were killed in Alexandria, just a few blocks from the hotel I was staying at. And so over the next few weeks is that instead of the usual religious controversies that were happening in Egypt, the two communities came together, the Christian community and the Muslim community. And so when we were out there, we actually saw these signs which were supporting a Christian-Muslim unity and basically just asking for peace. You can see a crescent and a cross right here. And this is important because just 3 weeks later, the protests started. And instead of these two groups, the Christians and the Muslims, being opposed to each other, what happened is you had things like this. This is a picture from Twitter where you had Copts and Muslims working together as kind of a unified population. Religion played no role in this, or a very small role in these protests. That this concept of a national identity was really strong here. So the last thing I just want to touch on is the most obvious thing. It's Islam in Egypt. And when you look at the Cairo skyline, you'll see towers all around. These towers are minarets, right? So this is where you hear the Muslim call to prayer. And Islam is a relatively recent introduction into Egypt. And so it started in the 7th century, really soon after Muhammad preached the Muslim word in Mecca and Medina. And so within 100 years, it was in Egypt. And over the next few centuries, it developed. And so I just wanted to point out one of these dynasties that ruled this area, the Fatimid dynasty. And so the Fatimids were, So the Fatimids were important because, first of all, they were the people who founded Cairo. They put their capital right here in Cairo. And so Cairo is a relatively recent city. The second thing that's important about them is that they were lovers of knowledge. And so one of the first things they did is, they founded this in 969. By 970, they had founded a mosque here, the Al-Azhar Mosque. And with this mosque was a madrasa, a religious school, which eventually turned into the second university in the world. And so the Western concept of the university is actually relatively recent, I think from the 12th century. And so already 300 years before, we had institutes of learning where people could come and learn languages and learn and study physics and study geography. We had this that existed in Cairo 300 years before it existed in the West. And so this university, this concept of learning was part of this 300-year-long golden age of Islam, when they were the warehouse of learning throughout the world. So, okay, so just real quick to wrap it up, just a few lessons on historical mindedness. So when we look at these protests around the Middle East and North Africa, we see places where revolutions have happened, Egypt and Tunisia. We have places where revolutions are in progress, and these other places are places where we see protests. And so when we apply a historical mindedness kind of way of looking at this, we ask, first of all, does it have a strong national identity? Is it a country? For Egypt, this has been a country for the last 200 years. In the case of Libya, for example, Libya was 3 separate colonies that were only cobbled together by Mussolini in, I think, 1934 or so. So Libya just doesn't have a very strong identity. In fact, the eastern part was connected to the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire 1,500 years ago, whereas the western part was controlled by the Latin-speaking part of the Roman Empire. Their differences go back a long way, and their concept of country is not very deep. Religion. Sometimes we look at Islam as this monolithic body, but in fact, you have periods or countries where Shiites are in power, for example, Iran. And you have other places where Sunnis or other sects like the Wahhabis are in power. And just like you look at the history of the West, you see a break between different branches of churches. In Islam, you have to ask these same questions. Are there different branches of it, and is it not just one monolithic body? The second one is looking at, I guess, majority and minority populations. For example, the Copts, who make up 15% of the population here, are important. When we're looking at Bahrain, right here, which is undergoing a revolution, we see that 80% of it is Shiite Muslim, whereas the rulers are Sunni Muslim. And then, of course, one of the other big history questions is, if we look at history in terms of natural resources, who and what role does it play? So I would encourage you guys, whenever you travel, whenever you look at the news, to just apply this concept of big history and to just look at really deep, ask yourself questions of why are things and how are they related to things that we don't see now, but that history has taught us. So, okay, so that's all I have here.
Good. Anybody have a quick question for David? Alex?
Yeah. What resources do you use to gain that historical mindedness? I guess when you go about asking questions, is there different to like get through it?
Oh, so I found a neat way. It's that so this trip I actually traveled with my Kindle, and so when I'd go to visit a site, and then I'd see something, go like, hey, what is that? And I'd actually just be able to look it up on the Kindle, download the book that night, and just be able to kind of read it while I was at the site almost. Yeah,
Wow.
so it was just kind of a really neat way of having a library with me as I was traveling, as opposed to, in the past I'd written stuff down in my journal, and then eventually I'd come back and look at it, but a month later you're just not as interested as opposed to when you were there. So. Cool, thanks.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it very much. Thanks. Well, if people would like to take a moment to refocus while we get the other computer set up, we'll do something else.
It's actually
Okay, I apologize for the delay getting it set up. I think it's ready to go. So we're going to be moving now into a different part of the course. Remember, of the four regimes, cosmos, earth, life, and humanity, we've really now covered the first two, cosmos and earth. And of course, I'm terribly distressed that we're leaving the earth because that's my favorite part. But we're going to move now into looking at the history of life. And, ooh, yeah, all right. Somebody else's favorite part. So I have to confess that up until recently, this was always the hardest part of the course for me because it's so complicated. I mean, the history of life has got so many branches on the evolutionary tree. How do you deal with it? That was always a problem. I would like to point out that when we were talking about the Earth, I was pointing out to you that there are features of Earth history that are very cyclical, like the water cycle, like the supercontinent cycle. We looked at a bunch of them. And then there are things that are events, like the multiple impacts in the Ordovician, like the deglaciation of the Spokane flood. And I kept pointing out that there also are trend-like features, which kind of continues in one direction. And when we're getting now to life history, we're very much in that sort of a mode, because there's just very little question that you've gone from no life to very simple life to moderately complicated life to extremely complicated life like us, and then even to the societies that we've built. So we're really in the regime of trend-like activity in history. But it was always so hard to talk about because there were all of these branches. And how do you deal with a tree like that? I have a new way to do it, but let me just show you here how difficult it is. So this is, you can hardly see what that is at this point, but this is a tree of life, and it's set out as a circle. And it's available on the web. It's from a book called The Time Tree of Life that we'll be dealing with today. And Roland turned this into a zoomable version. So let me just show you what happens. So there's sort of a circle in the center for ornamentation. And then this right here, well, let's zoom in on it a little bit. So that's the first beginnings of life, and here it keeps branching, and so you see it's like it's like a tree of different organic things, but it's been spread around into a circle because otherwise it makes up such a huge thing. So let's just kind of see what's here. So these are dates now in million years ago. So the origin of the Earth is 4, 5, 6, 7. You remember, and life gets started somewhere in here. It's not quite at all clear. 542, that's the beginning of the abundant fossil record, when there are lots of shells and bone, lots of fossils, especially shells in the fossil record. But it keeps coming out. The Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction is in here someplace. And you see this is sort of a logarithmic scale because there's lots more information in younger times, but just sort of look at what's going on here as you zoom in. So here are these early branches, and maybe that'll sharpen up in a minute, and maybe it won't. But anyway, so it goes out here, and all these different branches, and around here, there's one that's starting to clear up, maybe. Well, I'm sorry about that, but at any rate, what's written out here are the names of all of the different family level groups of organisms. And as you can see, and maybe especially if I back out so that the blur doesn't matter too much. I think this is just the hooking it up by air bears here. But at any rate, you can see the complexity of this thing. So how do you deal with that? And so the first 2 or 3 times that we taught big history here, I kept trying to somehow figure out how to show all that. And then finally I had a much better idea. And the idea is, let's skip most of the complexity and focus on the history of human beings, the life history that has led to us as individual human beings. And that would not be too popular with people like maybe Ryan, who knows an awful lot about mollusks, and might think in his heart of hearts that maybe what we should be doing is doing a molluscocentric view of the Earth. But since we're human beings, and this is a history course and it's going to end up dealing with human history, why don't we just look at the history of the human body? So let's think about this for a second. This is very nice because we have audio-visual aids everywhere around us. I mean, look at the person next to you and just think about them as a body, as a human body. So what do we have? I mean, we have some obvious things like we have hair, right? A lot of animals don't have hair. Snails don't have hair, right? So we have hair, we have a nose, and anybody here, well, if anybody here right now has a cold, they may have a wet nose, but in fact, generally we have dry noses, right? And we have 2 eyes, and we have a body that is more or less symmetrical around this plane here. It's not quite, because your heart is on the left. It's not exactly symmetrical, but it's pretty much symmetrical. There are other animals who don't have bilateral symmetry. They've got maybe radial symmetry, or maybe they're little spheres or something like bacteria. What else do we have? We have 2 ears, and notice that they're external ears. They've got these things outside. Okay, so we've got that, yeah.
5 fingers.
You have a hand, and your hand has 5 fingers, and your feet have 5 Toes, almost everybody does, right? You have a sense of smell?
2 arms, 2 legs.
You got 2 arms, 2 legs, and that's part of the bilateral symmetry thing, don't you? But you don't have 6 arms and legs. You have 4, right? Do we have a tail? No, but some of our relatives do. Yeah. You have a digestive tract, don't you? That starts here and it goes through, and then there's a waste disposal system. And very important for biology, we all have reproductive organs. And what else do we have? Well, anyhow, there's a bunch of things, right? We have a jaw, pardon? We have teeth. We have a jaw, and inside our mouth we have teeth. And we have a tongue. Oh, pardon? You have oh yeah, that's right. We have brains too. We have big brains, absolutely. Speaking of tongues, Millie and I were talking about this the other day, and thinking it's kind of curious how different organisms use what's essentially the same body part in different ways. So we use our tongue for talking, primarily, right? Dogs use their tongue for cooling off by panting, right? And cats use their tongue for cleaning themselves, right? So there's essentially the same organ. What do you call it? Homolog, is that right? A homolog, right? And it's used by different organisms in different ways. So we have all these body parts like the hand. And so what I'd like to do with you today is to take you on a trip through the history of evolutionary changes that led to us. And whenever I think of it, or whenever you think of it and mention it, let's find out when these different parts came to be. Because they can be, we think of our body as a nicely functioning whole. All the parts work together, and for most people. And it's amazing. It almost seems like it was designed. But it's very different. If you think about, say, 2 parts of your body. Let's take your jaw and your butt, okay? So your jaw starts in the Ordovician, back at the same time that those meteorites were falling on Sweden, and the same time that there was glaciation in the middle of the Sahara. That's when your jaw starts. Your butt is much more recent, because it has to do with us changing from 4 feet on the ground posture to 2 feet on the ground posture. And if you were used to being in this posture, and if you think about what organisms are like who have 4 feet to hold them, basically the backbone is essentially a connector between the front pair of legs and the hind pair of legs. For us, we've got our body sitting straight up in the air. Something's got to hold it up. That's your gluteus maximus, okay? So I thought it would be fun to go through and look at what has led to us. And that way, you can think with what David reminded you about historical mindedness. Think about your own body with historical mindedness. Think of it as a document of evolution. So let's do that. And I may have a little trouble moving back and forth here, but let me try and show you, first of all, this. What I'm trying to find is chronozoom.
Walter, you have it in a tab already.
I have what?
The second tab from the left.
Second tab from the left? That one. Thank you. That was it. You found that well. Okay, let's see. I think we're already part of this, aren't we?
You have to sign in if you want to use it.
I thought I already did. Complete. Should work. Should work. Okay. There we go. Okay. So here's chronozoom, the first version, and not refreshing very well, but if you remember, this whole area in here was cosmic history, and then this is life history, and we can click here and zoom in on that. Earth and life history. And so there were a lot of things down here that we looked at before, I think impacts and things like that, which are which are part of Earth history. But up at the top, we had this drawing, which was the family tree of humanity based on DNA. So you can go and get on the web and play with that, and I trust you will after today's class. But I'm going to shift to Adobe Illustrator because I've fixed this up. I made some changes in it, and it hasn't been put into zoomable form yet. So what I want to do is look at it here with you. And so we're going to be tracing from the beginning of life to human beings. Ryan?
Before you jump into this,
Yeah.
I think it's worth emphasizing that anything that looking forward on an evolutionary tree looks inevitable. So don't be misled in looking at this tree and saying we're going to follow this branch and it kind of inevitably leads to humans and humanity as we now know it. Because that's a little bit like, well, it's observer's bias, right? We live in the present, and so the present looks inevitable. But I think a better way to look at it, the better way to think about it is if we're looking backwards in time through the evolutionary tree, what are the elements that kind of led to us? And so I just to kind of underscore the randomness that has gone on.
Yeah, Ryan's got a really good point there. So there are many things that could have happened as evolution unfolded. And we're going to be looking at what did happen, but none of it was ever inevitable. So I absolutely agree with that point. So let's look at this. Now, the way this thing is laid out here, remember, chromosomes always goes from old on the left to young on the right. And this is basically the branching tree of life. And what we did when we made this tree was to eliminate all of the branches that didn't lead to us. How do I want to say it? We didn't show the detail in the branches that lead to us. That's what I want to say. So for example, if we go up here to, I've got to remember I can't zoom anymore. Here we go. So if we go up there, for example, always the upper branch is going to be the one that leads to human beings. We're going to be over here at the very top. Of course, we put ourselves at the top. And the other branch comes down here. So at this point, well, say in this one, when where fungi branch off, then a fungus expert would be shocked that we don't have all the branches that lead to all the different kinds of fungus. But what I'm trying to do is to get this complexity to a manageable level. So all the way through, you'll see the branches that lead to human beings, and the other branch will just be shown as a straight line going all the way to the end. But keep in mind always that this is a branch that's just as rich as the one we're following. It's just that we've left those parts out, okay? All right, so let's kind of go through this and help me remember from time to time to think about how this ties into our body. So, okay, so here we are. So, one more thing I need to tell you. This particular chart is based on studies of DNA. So this is a molecular genetics family tree of life. And the reason I've used it is because there is a book, a recent book, it's called The Time Tree of Life, that gives all the relationships between different groups of organisms based on how similar or how different their DNA is. And there are inferred dates at which the breakups take place. So for example, according to the book, this particular breakup here took place at 3,806 million years ago. My guess is there's a little false precision in there, but at any rate, this book represents a coherent rationalized, fit-together set of dates. So it made it possible to draw this picture. So this is based on DNA. The other way of figuring out the family tree of organisms is based on fossils. And sadly, there is no such compilation, internally consistent compilation. I've been leaning on the people down in the paleo department to try to make one so that we could get it on. But you're seeing one now that's based on DNA just because that was the available data set. And there are quite substantial differences between the fossil-based data set and the DNA-based data set, and we can talk about those as we go through. So at any rate, remember the Earth begins over here where there's 4,300 million years ago. It begins at 4, 5, 6, 7, which is just a little bit off the left side of the thing. In fact, you can see it down here. There. Okay, so there's the beginning of the Earth at 4, 5, 6, 7. Remember, in chronozoom, you can see where your pointer is up here on the scale at the top. So this starts with something called Luca. And Luca is not an Italian gangster. Luca is the last universal common ancestor, the inferred ancestor of every living thing that's on the planet at the present time, because there's no evidence for more than one origin of life. There's nobody else around who has a completely different style of DNA. We're all keeping our genetic information. We mean from fungus to protozoans to us to trees. Everything is keeping our information, our genetic information, in DNA, and it's basically the same kind of stuff. And I should apologize in advance if I say something that isn't quite right here, because this is not my field, but I've studied it a lot, so we'll see what happens. At any rate, here's the last universal common ancestor, and over here it breaks up at 4,200 million years into the eubacteria, or sometimes it's called bacteria. These are one of two groups of prokaryotes, or they're not eukaryotes like us, and in fact we're going to hear about that that'll be the subject for Thursday, so I'm a little bit out of sequence here. But at any rate, here is the breakup into that and the ancestor of archaea, which is these things were confused together as long as all people could do was look at them under a microscope, because they're all just little spheres or little rods with tails. They all kind of look more or less the same. It was only when DNA studies began that people realized that these are absolutely fundamentally different from each other. Their DNA is extremely different. And I think David will tell us something about that on Thursday. At any rate, what's the branch here going to be? Anybody know what that's going to be? It doesn't have a name there for a certain reason. Because one of the most remarkable things in the history of life happens just off the right. So let's go see it over here. So this is one where probably a relative of the archaea and some form of eubacteria did not split and divide, they actually joined. So many of you are aware of this. This is called the endosymbiosis event, and it was fundamental in giving the kind of cells that we have in our bodies, which are called eukaryotic cells. So now I can zoom in on this and show you what the eukaryotic cell looks like. It's bigger and more complicated than the ones of the archaea and the bacteria, and it has a nucleus. The others don't have a nucleus, and the genetic information is kept here in the nucleus of the cells. And then in addition, it has a bunch of other stuff in there. Well, it has a very thin shell wall, but it has things like mitochondria, and those are little bodies that are important in the energy processing that we have. And this was a absolutely wonderful discovery of, do you know when it was? Probably Lynn Margulis, maybe 1960 something or something like that. Probably in the 60s. So Lynn Margulis is a biologist at Boston College or Boston University, I forget which. And she was at one point married to Carl Sagan, which is sort of an interesting sidelight. But she made this incredible discovery that the mitochondria and the rest of the cell had different origins. and that the mitochondria migrated into the ancestors of our cells and took up residence there in symbiosis. So the way that the effect of this was that the two working together were far more powerful than either one working by itself. And one of the lines of evidence that this is so is that mitochondria have different DNA than what's in the cell. And in fact, the mitochondria are passed on directly from mother to child, mother to child, mother to child. So the father's genes don't get into the mitochondria. They just kind of pass on, keeping their own mitochondrial genetic line going. And later in the course, we'll see how important that is for reconstructing how human beings have migrated all over the earth. But this is the, yeah, right. Matt.
Does that mean that there are kind of like distinct lineages of mitochondria that are different from human like DNA differences? So maybe different families of mitochondria throughout the world and different people?
There are genetic differences. I don't know. Do you know whether there are different families? Are there anybody?
Yeah, I mean, it diverges like any other kind of DNA. In fact, it diverges much faster because there's no error checking in the mitochondria, so the mutation is much faster. They won't recombine, so they'll get rid of the mutations very easily. So as a result, the evolution of mitochondrial DNA is at least twice as fast as most nuclear DNA. And they split with families just as easily.
So like all humans wouldn't have the same mitochondria?
All humans are more similar to one another than they are to anything else with respect to their mitochondria, but it's an incredibly diverse mitochondria genome.
Yeah, we will come back to that when we talk about human migrations. Anyhow, this is the first big step. And now let's see what happens to these eukaryotes. So we're following them up to here. And now I want to show you what I did. I may have some mistakes in here because I just did this last night. But at any rate, here are eukaryotes. And now remember, at each branching point, the upper path goes towards human beings. And the lower path goes to something else, and we've not shown any of the details in it. So this is when plants diverge from what are called opisthocons, which is a grouping of animals and fungi. So that tells you that we are more closely related to fungi than we are to plants. Okay? And what I've done all the way through here, I just went around on the web and found some pictures. So the picture here, the picture always refers to the lower line. So this picture of plants, which I could, move it down there so it's closer. At any rate, that one is going to show you a modern representative of what happens along this line. And maybe sometime I will, but I've not yet put in one for the upper because I figured I didn't have to, because you see, if you come along here, the lower line, the fungi is there. That is an opisthocont. Do you see how that works? So I didn't need to put one up here because there's an opisthocont right there. But always going all the way through, I've only shown the ones that were on the line that did not go to us. And this will be especially interesting when we get to where we can start seeing the evolution of the parts of our bodies that we were talking about earlier. But I do want to make a critical point here, and that is that there's something misleading here. This plant here is shown at 1,500 million years ago, which of course it didn't live then. It's living now. So if I were going to do this again, and probably will sometime, I would maybe have a line here that says 2 plants, or maybe there'd be an arrow that plants go down here. But really, this guy should be at the very end of the line because that plant is contemporary with human beings. Some photographer took its picture, right? So they are here just as a kind of a reminder of what's all the way down the end of the line. Okay, so this is a first big divergence into plants versus animals plus fungi, and now we can move over here and we see that dividing up, and you get the fungi leading down here, and then metazoans are multicellular animals, so these are true ones. And choanoflagellates are an absolutely fascinating little thing. Does anybody here know Nicole, what's her name in biology, who works on that? I guess you don't, and it would help if I remembered her last name. But she's an expert. These are single-celled eukaryotes, so they have a nucleus and mitochondria. They're single-celled, but at certain times during their life stages, they clump together, and they make little multicellular arrays. And the cells are all pretty much the same, but they clump together. And they have a feature in the shape of the cell which is found in sponges, which are the most primitive multicellular animals. So she's working on what looks like a modern representative of the kind of single cells that started to cluster together and make multicells. So one thing we didn't mention about our bodies is that they're multicellular, right? So it's somewhere right in here that comes into being, somewhere actually multicellular. I don't know. I think this includes single-celled plants. So something that's not on here and ought to be is where multicellularity comes in. One of the things that I've found in making these kind of diagrams is it points out to me all sorts of things that I don't know and ought to. And sometimes it points out to me things that the person who made the chart ought to have known and didn't. So for example, right here, in this one, there's a problem. Choanoflagellates should come before true metazoans because these are the single cells that occasionally clump together. And what happened in that book, The Time Tree of Life, it shows the split from animals to choanoflagellates at 10, 20 million years, but a later split as coming earlier. So in other words, they've got the sequence out of order in that book. So, you know, it's hard to make all of these things together, but you can see, when you start poking around on it, you start to find out, oh, somebody got it. This is either wrong, or maybe they didn't notice that it was wrong, or maybe they just don't know the answer, or maybe there's two viewpoints. Anyway, so let's go along here now and get to some of these things. So now we've got multicellular animals, the ones that lead to us over here. And on this side, off comes another branch, which is the sponges. And these seem to be the simplest, really true multicellular organisms, but they have some interesting things about them. The sponge cells are not very differentiating. And we have all these different kinds, liver cells, brain cells, retinal cells, all these different things. The sponges is pretty much all the same. And but they join up together into particular shapes, okay? And so we'll leave them going off their way now and see what happens to us eumetazoa. So over here, this is a split of multicellular eukaryotes like us. And this is recognized as a split in which some types developed radial symmetry, like corals and like jellyfish. So there's some jellyfish. I can go in there and show you. So you can see the radial symmetry on those. And others, which led to our line, which have bilateral symmetry. So this bilateral symmetry is one of the first things that comes in. I think we should realize in here that although I don't have a particular thing about it, some of our other features have got to be truly ancient like that. Clearly the digestive tract has to be truly ancient because any organism has got to have nourishment or it doesn't live. And also the reproductive apparatus has to come really early because otherwise the line doesn't continue. So what I'm realizing is, as I've been playing around making this, is there's all sorts of opportunities to develop this and make it into hopefully a clearer and clearer picture of how our bodies have come to be. So just a start at any rate. Okay, so let's go on now here. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. In fact, why don't I? Well, won't hurt you. Okay. So let's move on here now and see. Remember, these are the bilaterally symmetrical ones. And here is a breakup into these strange names. And we are something called deuterostomata, and that includes vertebrates, echinoderms, and their relatives. And the other one that broke off is this one, protostomata, including arthropods, mollusks, and their relatives. So I put a snail in there to represent the mollusks of the protostomata. Now, one thing I want to point out to you, or re-emphasize, is for these people, this happened 910 million years ago. For most paleontologists, that happens around 500 million years ago. So there's complete difference between the dates that people are getting out of these two different systems. And it's a big question right now in evolutionary biology and paleontology. How do we reconcile these sets of dates that don't agree? Michelle? It's systematic. You mean these different dates?
Like when the difference between the fossil record and the DNA. Like could it be because when the DNA maybe split that the organism hadn't acquired enough?
I suspect that's right. I don't know if you could hear what she was saying, but could the reason be that the genetic change happens early, and that's what's here represented by the 9-10 million years, and that it takes some time before the differences in shapes really develop, and what the paleontologists are seeing is the changes of shapes. So that may have something to do with it. There's another aspect of it, though, that the paleontologists can date their fossils real well because they occur in stratified rocks, and we can date those with radiometric dating and things like that. So we really have good dates on lots of fossils. You don't have good dates on the DNA because there's nothing in the DNA that's datable. And so what they generally say is, well, let us assume that the rate of change, the number of DNA units that mutate, that rate is the same, but nobody has any reason to think that. Ryan, you got to comment on any of that? Yeah.
Sure. I think a couple things that are going on. First, with paleontology, it's more precise in a sense because you have a fossil of something, and it's at a stratigraphic layer of known dates. So you've got a particular distance of 500 million years. With a fair bit of certainty that jellyfish existed at 500 million years because it was there, fully formed at 540 million years. So, in a sense, your error is pretty small. With DNA, you have error, so you could estimate the divergence date as being sooner than it actually was or later than it actually was. So I think that you have error bars on both sides of your estimated date, if that makes sense. And those error bars are not only smaller with paleontology, but I think they're asymmetrical because it's easier to have a falsely older date than it is to have a falsely early date because if the body of the organism was there at a particular date, it was in fact there. It can't have been. It can't have not been there at that particular point in time, which is a terrible explanation. Clearer if I could draw a picture of it, but there's that going on. And the other is people are developing increasingly sophisticated models of molecular evolution, and as that happens, we have fancier and fancier math to work backwards in time. But anything at more than a couple hundred million years ago is very, very fuzzy. So especially these very deep nodes on the tree are never going to be resolved with any certainty by molecular data alone.
Good, thanks. Okay, well let's go on and see some more of the things that have happened here. So we now have a breakup into chordates, and again, that's us in the upper one. And these are animals that have a notochord. It's actually something that's present in the embryo. And the ones that go the other way include echinoderms, which is like starfish and sand dollars, and then hemichordates, which I don't know about, I confess. And then some of the chordates later in this branch develop backbones or spinal columns. So remember, the picture always refers to the lower line. So here's some funny little creature in here who has a notochord in the embryonic stage, but does not develop a backbone. So he's not a vertebrate. But here, now we can track out the vertebrates and see what happens to them. So, okay, your backbone, you got a backbone back there? All right, that's when it comes into being. All right, now we come up to something here, stomata. Okay, that means animals with jaws. So remember I was pointing out the jaw comes in the Ordovician, according to paleontology. Well, that's a problem because the Ordovician is about 450 million years ago. Remember, that's the time of the Swedish meteorites and the Saharan glaciers. But these guys have got it coming in at 600 and something. And the paleontologists would say, nope, 450. So you see there's a big, and almost always the DNA makes the splits earlier than the fossils do. And my guess is that probably in the next 10 years or so we'll understand why that is and have better numbers. But for the moment we don't. Alex?
How come you don't put both numbers there?
The reason I didn't put both numbers was that I couldn't see how to do it in a way that wasn't going to be really messy. But what I'm hoping to do is to challenge the people in the Paleo Museum to come up with a coherent, equivalent picture based on fossils. And the dates will be better, or at least the dates will be based on knowing the ages of the actual fossils. And then what I'd like to do is say this one is here, just running parallel to it, put in the one with the fossils, and then you maybe could draw some tie lines and they would show how far off some of these things are. Yeah, okay. So this guy here's the ones that lead to us, fishes with jaws leading to us with jaws, and here are some, this guy kind of gives me the creeps. This is a lamprey, and you see he's got a mouth. And what they do, I believe this is right, they have a mouse, he's got no jaw. And what they do is, if there's a fish swimming by, and they can kind of suction cup themselves onto it. And then you can see he's got teeth in there, or some sort of rasping things, and he can kind of eat away what's in there, but he doesn't have jaws to chew with. So not something you want to have hooking onto you, but anyhow, there he is. So that guy, you're not descended from him. But and remember, we're not talking land animals yet, because this is now a time when everything is in the ocean. So we're basically, all the vertebrates at this point are fish, or fish-like things. So let's take another split. So now we get to this point. These are osteichthyes. Ichthyes has to do with fish. So these are bony fish. And these are fish that have cartilage. So sharks don't have bones, they have cartilage in them, right? And clearly it's not a disadvantage to have cartilage, because the sharks have done extremely well, thank you, and they're still around. Remember, of course, always that these guys belong way up on the right-hand end. I'm showing them here, but they are modern representatives. They belong way off on the right-hand side. So there's the shark, and remember Nicholas Steno finding these things called tungstones in the Tuscan countryside, and people didn't know what they were, and when he dissected a shark, he found that's exactly what they were. They were shark's teeth. So this guy now has jaws, he has teeth, but he doesn't have bones. He's got cartilage for his skeleton. Yeah.
Is the one backbone though, if they're not completely bone?
What is a shark's spinal column like? Anybody know? I don't know. Why don't you look it up and find out? Let us know sometime, okay? Okay, so anyhow, the bony ones up here. Okay, now it starts to get really interesting, because we've now got bony fishes. And at this point, which these guys say now is in the Ordovician, 450 million years, but for paleontologists would be younger than that. Now you see you have a break up here, or a division into ones that are called ray-finned fishes and ones that are called lobe-finned fishes. So the fin on the fish is completely different. So look at this one. These are the ray-finned fishes, and basically their fins have little thin spines in them. You probably, if anybody here a fisherman, a catcher of fish? Well, if you were, or if you hung around fish markets, you would see all those little thin spines in the fins. But there's another group here that have much more substantial fins. See how much more substantial that is? This is the famous coelacanth, which is it was known from the fossil record, but for a long time nobody had ever seen one. They were thought to be extinct. And then some fishermen out in the Atlantic off of Africa, I don't know when this was, probably 80 years ago or something, they fished one up, and apparently there are still coelacanths. So this is a live coelacanth, and they live down. Look how much more substantial these fins look like than on this little guy here. And if this hadn't evolved, maybe we wouldn't have, because it was those bony, substantial fins that evolved into legs and allowed fish-like creatures gradually to migrate onto the land. So this is really critical. So when you look at your hand with the 5 fingers in it, or your foot with the 5 toes, this is the source of it. It's coming out of those. It originally came out of those lobed fins in creatures like the coelacanth. Okay, so where are we now? Now we've got this group are. Let's see. Okay, so I sort of got 2 of them a little bit lumped together here. This was the split into ray-finned fish, and this one into lobe-finned fishes. Now we've got this group going off, which continue to be fish. This is clearly a fish. But some of their relatives then gradually evolved into 4-legged vertebrates. Now this one is shown here as being somewhere in the kind of 400 million year range. And for paleontologists now, that's Devonian. So actually these aren't too far off. This here would be in somewhere in the 300s for the paleontologists. So this particular, somebody asked, why didn't I put both of those in there? It looks like the difference in the timing in these 2 methods of determining the history, it's different for different nodes. This one is a little closer than some of the others. So anyhow, now we get up here, 4-legged vertebrates. And by the way, there is presently a lot of new fossils that show the transition from lobe-finned fish into terrestrial vertebrates. There's a whole bunch of them have been found through this time interval called the Devonian, probably 6 or 8 different types, and you can just kind of see the transitions going on from one to the other. Okay, so now we're on to animals that live on land. They have 4 legs. They live on land. And some of them go off and become frogs and toads and salamanders, which have eggs that have to be laid in water. But then there's another set off here that have eggs that can be laid on land. And that includes both reptiles and mammals. And now you start seeing some things coming in that are pretty interesting. Here's a reptile. And here's some of the things that mammals have. They have sweat glands, they have hair, they have milk. So that's our line. And over here, these guys continue to the present time. That's why I put him here. But both of these are extinct. I'm sorry, this is extinct. That isn't. But whoops. Dinosaurs, you can't figure out what happened by DNA because you can't get DNA out of dinosaurs. They've been dead for so long that any DNA that might be there is completely degraded. So that's an advantage of the fossil method, is that you can deal with extinct organisms and you can't with the DNA ones. So let's keep on going over here. Here we've gotten some, we're seeing different groups of mammals. I think Theria means beasts. So this is sort of original beasts, as it were. And these are true beasts, and these are changed beasts. I kind of love those names. Anyhow, here are some egg-laying mammals, the Prototheria. But now you see this group goes on, and their eggs never come outside. This is the live birth starts in here. Oh, and here's some things. Somebody pointed out early on that we have ears. Okay, here's where external ears come in. So look at here. This is a platypus from probably Australia, I think. You see, no external ears. But over here on this line, there's the kangaroo, and you can see the kangaroo has the external ears. So keep thinking about your body as a historical record, a historical document. Okay? So let's go over and see what happens here. And so here are marsupials, including kangaroos, and here are placental mammals that leads to us. And we come over here and we get a whole bunch more of these breaking off. And I won't take the time to go through them in detail, but there are elephants. And these are mammals that originated in South America and Africa, because now we're at a time when Pangea has broken up and continents are separate from each other. And so that is starting to be recognizably the controls over why you get one group of animals here and one group of animals there. It's because they used to be, or their home used to be one supercontinent. Now it's broken apart, and so the two groups can't get at each other. So it's this reproductive isolation is generally thought to be responsible for a lot of the divergence of different groups like this. So here at Atlantogenata, these guys are represent things from South America and Africa, but see here are ones from northern continents. Boreal means high latitudes in the north. And so here's where some things come off, like groups like bats, hoofed mammals, carnivores, and whales. Now, let me point out that if you look at a biology book from 10 or 20 years ago, you won't see these, you will not see these groupings. And that's because there were all these different groups of mammals around, like rodents, rats, tree shrews, hares, bats, hoofed mammals, carnivores, whales, all elephants, these things. And people didn't know what the relationships between them were on the basis of modern living specimens or fossils. But with the DNA, you can say, look, this one is more closely related to that than it is to something else because of the degree of similarity in the DNA. So one thing the DNA has really done is make it possible to clarify what is the shape of this family tree. But what it doesn't do very well is to give you the dates where the changes took place. So we're going up through here. We've got here our rabbits and things like that, and then you get some things that are less familiar to us, like tree shrews and flying lemurs. Probably haven't seen too many of those. I certainly haven't. Okay, here's a wet-nosed primate. Remember, we're dry-nosed primates. So they're the dry-nosed primates taking off there, and then they keep splitting up into things. And here are tarsiers. Again, not very familiar to me. And then there's a big split between New World monkeys, basically meaning South America and Central America, versus Old World monkeys and apes, which are Africa and Asia and India. Again, separated by the Atlantic Ocean, so they went their own different way. And so the biologists have tended to split those up based on the shape of their nose. So these are flat-nosed ones, and these are prominent-nosed ones like us, right? So we are going to see a split off there. Okay. So here's some New World monkeys, or the flat-nosed ones are down here, and then up. It goes on, doesn't it? Well, we're getting close. Okay, so here are Old World monkeys and apes. And at this point then, you have a split up, and you have Old World monkeys going off there, and there come apes. And at this point, I ran out of time to find pictures. And I'm sorry about that, but gibbons go off here, and orangutans, See gorillas like that, and then here are humans and extinct relatives. And if you go to your chronozoom and look at that Earth and life history one, you'll see that this one goes on there. This line goes on into the ancestral, you know, pre-human but not very different things like Lucy and Artie, the Australopithecus and Ardipithecus, and then on into the species Homo and us. So what I'd like to do just to kind of show you, just let's back off of this and let me just zoom out, which you can go back and do it, and sort of see here's human and extinct relatives, and by the way, there's 0 right there. So you are here, right? Okay, so let's just go back in time and watch this zoom back out so that you can get a sense of how much we've talked about and how much background ancestry there is to us. So just zooming out like that. Now you can't read those ones in the upper right any longer. There's the time scale up above. Now you can't see the ones in the upper right any longer. We'll keep going out. There's the jaw comes in right there. Back out. Here's the bilateral ones and radial ones. Here's plants come in there. We keep on going all the way back. So that's our family tree writ large. See you next week.